Okay. Thank you. Very organized. All right, now we will move into the presentation mode.
Good morning, Council. My name is Hans Wilson, and I'm a professional engineer here to present to you kind of a, how do I say, a flashback, for lack of a better term. Last time we met in this kind of venue, we had a project that had been basically narrowed down to on behalf of the Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance. And City Council came out with an RFQ to basically rewind and look at perhaps 3 other alternatives to answer that question about alternatives. And in conversations with city staff, that was going to take a fair amount of time and a fair amount of cost that I felt would be better applied to perhaps the permitting exercise that eventually we'll have to go through if this project moves forward. My suggestion, and staff concurred, was to put together an assessment matrix that looked at not just 3 locations, but potentially 6 locations to answer those questions from the population about, well, what about here? So we went ahead and started with what I'm going to call the big picture approach to kind of narrow down options based on things that include safety, and that's in the report, but also talk about distances traveled, resource impacts, those types of things. So as I said, just as an introduction, we looked at these alternative channel alignments, and really the goal was, there's a number of things. The principal goal was just reducing some of the travel time to get from the interior portions of Punta Gorda Isles out to Charlotte Harbor. There's also secondary issues. Some people in this audience feel maybe primary issues, and that has to do with safety, having a secondary access to the canal system during foul weather events that jump up. If anybody's a boater in here, you know the weather can change in a heartbeat in Southwest Florida. There was also some discussions about what happens if a boat sinks and I can't get my boat in. That was a big issue that came up in part of our public meetings. So we looked at 6 different options, and I'm going to try with this pointer to show you. It was hard to get everything set into this PowerPoint, but basically we've got 6 locations. We've got up here in the upper left-hand corner, which is the old barge canal that is fairly wide, fairly deep. A lot of people say, well, gee, that might be a good location. We also have a mosquito control ditch that runs down through here. That was another location that made sense. We have a secondary, I'm sorry, that was Ponce Inlet up there. This is the barge canal. We had a secondary mosquito control district ditch that existed there. The third location we looked at was basically what many people called Smuggler's Cut, of which we already had some partial information. And then the last 3 options were some combination of access in this area to get to Alligator Creek. I've got a lot of information here, so I'm going to try and bang through this pretty quickly, but that's the map, and just keep that in mind. And some of the other things, and we'll get to this map again in the presentation, but some of the things to think about is we also took a look at where the halfway points were for travel distances from different communities within the development. This is the barge canal, and you'll see on the barge canal, we took a look at a couple things, and we had to make some very broad brush assumptions because, again, this is the big picture looking down without spending a lot of public resources on field mapping. Things, for example, that we looked at is we took a look at this section of the channel right here. We made an assumption that that was probably a gradually tapering depth that went from basically -1 at the base of the mangroves to a -6, which was our control depth. We looked at a channel width that was going to be 50 feet at the bottom with a controlling depth of -6 mean low water. This was actually some of the input that we received and what we looked at as probably the best channel design given a lot of other features that were out there. You'll see that there's a little triangle up in the corner here. That number 1 is number of turns you have to make. And in the matrix, you're going to find we actually put in a ranking for the number of turns, which actually, as you'll see, adjusted the selection process. We've got cross-section AA right here. We've got cross-section BB. And again, those sections are designed to represent kind of what we see as the environment at that location. This is what the cross sections look like. We looked at the width of the barge canal. We looked at the average depth of the barge canal. There's a couple of mangrove plugs at each end. And then we also took a look at what the design section would be in, out in the open water. My pointer's failing. The next location we looked at was the mosquito ditch. You see a cross-section CC and a DD. Again, we had the triangle with one turn at the top. So you're coming and making a 90-degree turn. That was what I considered to be the biggest safety issue, is if I'm making a 90-degree turn. If I've got a dog leg, which you see about halfway down that cut, we didn't consider that to be an issue. Even a 45-degree turn, we didn't consider that to be a navigational issue. But when you're making a 90-degree turn, that was what we did consider to be a navigational issue. You're going to see the cross section here. We have what we look at the mosquito ditch. And similar to the barge canal, we feel that in a lot of those mosquito ditches, they have side cast what they dug. And a lot of those spoil islands are actually areas that exotic vegetation has established over time. So we decided that it would be best, same thing with the barge canal, to center the proposed channel, which you see the really nice cut 3-to-1 slope, 50 foot at the bottom, in the middle of those waterways, because what that will end up doing, even though we know we're going to impact mangroves, we're also going to be removing spoil piles and eliminating potential exotic vegetation habitat. You'll see the section DD is out in the open water, in the shallow water areas, and of course that cross section varies. Close to the mangroves, you would see basically no water depth, and then as you get out to the -6, we're going to match that contour out in Charlotte Harbor. Here's Smuggler's Cut, also referred to as Poacher's Pass. I think there's been a few other comments about that. This is section EE, FF, and GD. You'll note that the area that we looked at, if you're coming down Smuggler's Cut, just before you get to section FF, most people make a left-hand turn there and continue on around into Alligator Creek, in part because the area around section GG is very shallow. And we've actually mapped Smuggler's Cut, so we had good information, so we knew water depths in there were about 3.5 feet mean low water. So we were able to, and we took off the aerial photographs, the general width of Smuggler's Cut, and we created this section EE, which gives you a sense of what that would look like today. And then if we dug it out, obviously we have mangrove impacts again. But also at this location, we centered it because we've got side cast spoil piles that are locations for exotic encroachment. Basically, Brazilian pepper is about the only thing that really grows in those spoil piles. In the areas where we're just cutting through mangroves, section FF is an example of what that looks like. And on this section, on this particular layout, I'm going to show you that for every location where we have the cross sections, we went through and did calculations and made assumptions in terms of volumes, resource impacts relative to mangroves. We didn't look at seagrasses because A, we're not in seagrass growing season, B, seagrasses are spotty in Charlotte Harbor. And again, this was an order of magnitude assessment approach for City Council to get their arms around and say, you know, have we looked at all the options? Have we weighed what those are going to be? So everyone has got these calculations in terms of how many cubic yards would have to be dredged, generally speaking. It's an order of magnitude assessment. How many linear feet of resource is going to be impacted in terms of mangroves. So we have those volumes and those estimates, and that's what we applied into our assessment matrix. This is Bird Cut West A. This is alternative 4. This is shown to be, you're going to see a cross section, I think it's up at the top left, J1 and J2. This channel alignment basically makes a slight dog leg out of the Punta Gorda Isles Canal, continues parallel and outside of the west or southwest property line of property owned by Mr. McQueen, comes out to Alligator Creek, makes a connection. Now, the area you see of Alligator Creek, you see a number of sections there, M, N, O, P, and Q. That information was culled from the public notice that went out that Charlotte County, with the Corps of Engineers, that Charlotte County had submitted an application to dredge. We looked at their cross-section profiles. We looked at the areas that we would have to dredge to achieve a 50-foot bottom width at -6 feet. The design that Charlotte County has from channel markers 1 and 2, continuing up to where you see section MM, has a 75-foot wide channel width at the bottom, so we don't have anything that we have to do there. It narrows to 25 feet from MM all the way up the rest of Alligator Creek past our connecting site. Again, I want everybody to understand that this is a very preliminary design. This is an order of magnitude. What's the big picture here on these 6 alternatives? Which one do we want to pursue? A lot of the comments regarding sighting distances, angles, that comes through when you finally make a selection and you start doing the real final design for boater safety. We may be looking at things, for example, on this, the agencies may push us into an area where we have to have less resource impact. All these designs are based on making a 3-to-1 cut with the 50-foot bottom width. So if I'm making a 6-foot cut, you know, I've got at least 18 to 20 feet on each side in the shallowest areas of mangrove impacts. Well, as we start looking at final design, we're going to start building into that ways to achieve less resource impacts, reduce costs, that type of thing. So this is very preliminary. Now, the reason why I brought up the Alligator Creek is I'm going to show you, this is the Bird Cut West cross section, which is outside of anything that is already dredged other than where we connect in with Alligator Creek. And then I'm going to talk about Alligator Creek because the next 2 alternatives, 5 and 6, rely on the same database that we have here that we looked at. So Alligator Creek, when you go through that cross-section, we took cross-sections as we showed. I was talking about MM and NN and looked at the areas that have to be dredged. For example, on section NN, there is a very small amount of dredging that needs to be done in order to get to the -6 water depth and maintain that 50-foot navigable width because it's already almost 50 foot wide and almost 6 feet deep at that location. This is where we get into PQ. Cross-section Q and R are the greatest volumes that we have to dredge to get to that 50-foot base width. And then we went on to alternative 5. And again, alternative 5 and 6 rely on that same volume of cut in Alligator Creek. So that Alligator Creek section, those volumes and those impacts are exactly the same for all alternatives 4, 5, and 6. Bird Cut West B follows the inside of Mr. McQueen's southwest property line. It's on his property entirely until we get out to Alligator Creek. Again, we counted 1 turn as a significant turn. In that particular alignment, it's a straight shot right off of the canal into the new cut, but you have to make a 90-degree turn when you hang a right on Alligator Creek as you're exiting the waterway out to Charlotte Harbor. This is what the cross-section will look like. There's already a mosquito ditch there that has been dug that we would be basically working with in some fashion to minimize resource impacts. And then the last option, which was the option that was presented on behalf of the Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance, is alternative 6. And alternative 6, basically, when you took a look at all of the resource impacts, the volume of excavation, the linear foot that you're going to have to excavate, and you compared it to 4 and 5, which are all using Alligator Creek, it was the winner until you started plugging in how many turns you have to make in the channel. And this is where we're going to get to the assessment matrix, and that's when it comes out to be ranking as a second preferred alternative because of the number of turns. That's something for City Council to discuss with staff about how we want to adjust that. There are pros and cons to this alignment compared to the others. The most favorable one being that you're going to be negotiating with one property owner versus the governor and cabinet sitting as the trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund, which manages all the sovereign state lands. So this was the assessment matrix, the alternatives matrix that we came up with. That's kind of an overall view. I know nobody can read that. So as I'm aging, I also have to wear glasses. And so I thought, well, gee, you know what? Let me make this easy for everybody. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom in to the left-hand corner, which really nobody can read unless the screen was really big. But basically what we've got is we've got on the left-hand side the different factors. We've got channel length, we've got volume of excavation, we've got a number of different features that we talk about. And then I listed, kind of summarized them in that middle column. And then on the right-hand column, we did a ranking. And the ranking was basically 1 to 10. And the better the features were for each channel, the higher the number. And basically kind of made the whole assessment an independent process. So I'm going to start with the first one. This is the right-hand side where we actually plug the numbers in. And we have the notes on the right-hand side, which is how we calculated, for example, linear footage and broke that down. Excavation volume. We did everything in a very linear pro rata basis, so that if we had a 1,000-foot channel cut and we had a 3,000-foot channel cut, and those were the two extremes, we broke that down evenly in increments in between. Did that with volume. We did that with a lot of other features. Some of the things we could not do, and I will get into discussion on each one of these selection processes. Channel length. This is that left-hand column where we're talking about what we're looking at. We looked at channel length, and again, we looked at the -6 foot mean low water depth as the contour that we would intersect with in Charlotte Harbor, and we know that we've probably got a pretty good chance of a 6 foot mean low water depth right on the edge of the mangroves within the Punta Gorda Isles main perimeter canal. It's pretty deep there. Again, this has not been field verified. We're just making some broad brush assumptions, but I think they're pretty good. We made some assumptions about where the mangroves were located. Most mangroves, in my experiences, were about a foot above mean high water is a pretty good estimate of where they're going to establish. Obviously, red mangroves will survive in deeper water, but we know that blacks typically like drier feet, and so they're going to be at higher elevation. And so that was how we used that elevation in terms of establishing a 3-to-1 slopes on the side. Next item we looked at was excavation volumes. Basically, using that typical cross-section and those assumptions in terms of elevation, we looked at, if I'm excavating mangroves, I'm going from a +1 to a -6 mean low water. If I'm excavating open waters of Charlotte Harbor, I'm making an assumption that I'm at -1 feet at the edge of the mangroves out to -6 contour that I'm trying to intersect with, and that's a linear relationship, meaning it's a nice gradual drop-off. Until we field verify that for those channels that are located in Charlotte Harbor, for all I know, it could be -1 all the way out and then drop off to -6 in a 50-foot section. So we really haven't been able to field verify that yet, but again, the process here is to give you orders of magnitude and an understanding of what the options are. We also looked at some things, for example, the barge canal. City staff went out and actually verified water depths in the barge canal, so we had a really pretty good number with that. The mosquito ditch, growing up in Southwest Florida and running around and after they dug the mosquito ditches as a kid, generally these days as we look as mitigation, they're about 2 feet mean low water. They have a tendency to collect a lot of detrital material. And again, they weren't digging them real deep. They just wanted to get the water out of the mangroves as we were uninformed about the value of mangrove systems, been trying to get rid of mosquitoes. So those were the things that we used. And then, of course, the Alligator Creek public notice, we used that as our template for that -6. I was pleased to hear from Jay that they've approved the permit. Area of impact, that was the third item. We looked at, what resources are we impacting? Mangroves obviously were the easiest ones for us to assess on the aerial photographs. Seagrass is not so much, but we did find a report. Actually, I did a little bit of research. Actually, I did a lot of research on seagrasses in the area, and generally this area is pretty patchy. So the chances of seagrass in our alignment, if council came up with an alignment that took us out into Charlotte Harbor, then I would say, okay, we're going to have to wait until May 1st seagrass growing season to make sure we understand what seagrasses we might be impacting. Seagrasses are really difficult to mitigate for in the permitting process. Mangroves, actually you can buy mitigation credits for forested mangrove wetlands from Little Pine Island Mitigation Bank. Item 4, travel distance. This was a good one. 1532 Albatross Drive, that lucky property owner has the longest travel distance from Punta Gorda Isles to getting out to Charlotte Harbor. So we looked at the first leg is Albatross Drive down to what's called the Alternatives Junction. I'll bring that graphic back up here again. And when you get to that Alternatives Junction, the boater originating from 1532 has really 6 options depending on which option is chosen here. So we use the linear travel distance from that Alternatives Junction as the basis for the ranking, starting from there. This, again, gives you a sense. If you look at that arrow that's right in the middle, that's the 1532 Albatross lane. I don't think I got enough battery left in my pointer. Probably should have put some new ones. But he's coming down through here, out, and back up the inside. It's dead. Oh, wonderful. Thank you, sir. Great. Oh, perfect, okay. All right, 1532 Albatross Lane, that person has to come all the way down this canal system, turn, come all the way along the perimeter canal, all the way back up to Out Ponds Inlet. It's quite a travel distance. The junction location, this is what we call the alternative junction, because if that person's coming out and they get to this point, at that point, depending on which option is pursued, they've got 6 variables. So all of these distances that we've calculated are from that, basically that point. Now, it's clear, as you'll find out in the next slide, that this channel alignment, the barge canal, if I'm coming all the way from up here and I've made that distance all the way down, I don't really have much further to go to get to Ponce Inlet. So the value of that additional cut through is lessened because of the travel distance. The closer I get a cut through to this travel distance, then the better that is for time that I have to be on the water. Vessel traffic impacts Alligator Creek. This was a big issue with a lot of the residents. We used the Sea Grants Regional Waterway Management System for Charlotte County, and we looked at and broke down by region, based on those midway points on the graphic, the number of boats that could be built out within the community. The Sea Grant looks at the number of existing moorings. It also looks at how many moorings are currently available, which means if there's a dock, if there's a space that you can tie up a boat. And so we came up with some densities for the areas that would be utilizing Alligator Creek. These are the areas we looked at. This, I think we've got, I don't have my graphic with me that I can read through, but we've got a fairly high percentage of boaters that come down Alligator Creek. And we looked at these different alignments and then said, okay, out of these alignments, how does that affect these interior communities? And having personally counted many of these properties, we have what I believe is a pretty good count, either on like a condominium where they already have docks there that we could count slips, and generally we use 30 foot as a slip length to come up with a boat density along linear parallel dockage. And that was pretty consistent with the ones that were occupied. In other words, if we looked at a condominium that had a parallel dock, we counted the number of boats. Okay, on average, 30 foot was generally the length of the slip. So that's what we used to calculate how many slips might occur along linear dockage that basically had no boats tied up. So we came up with some numbers for vessel traffic density, and we applied those in this matrix in terms of what would occur. In the 4 alternatives here, and I think you'll be able to see it next, the increase in traffic was about 158% over the total population of boaters that would be using Alligator Creek at final build out. Okay, that's really important to think about because that's down the road quite a ways. Navigational visibility, this was an issue of concern we talked about. Again, I kind of touched upon the 90-degree turns. Visibility was an issue. Gradual bends like Alligator Creek are generally not an issue. The first 3 alternatives all require at least a 90-degree turn. Alternative 6 was the one that had some significant turns to navigate to Alligator Creek. And keep in mind, as we get down to an alternative that City Council wants to pursue, that's when we'll get into the design component, and we may be softening those turns in some fashion. We may be, my concern right now is any channel that comes to Alligator Creek right now is coming in almost at a 90-degree angle to the flow line of Alligator Creek. I've got to figure out how I'm going to keep that from filling in with sand over time. Alternative assumptions, sawfish and public interest. Again, anytime we're removing mangroves in less than 3 foot of mean lower low water, we're impacting small tooth sawfish habitat. That's a big permitting challenge for us on this project. Public interest, that's a fairly arbitrary assessment. The use of the barge canal as an option, where we talked about removal of the spoil piles on both sides of the canal to create the channel. We could consider that public interest because we'd be removing a potential source of exotic vegetation establishing. Ownership negotiations. Again, this is one of my favorite terms, arbitrary and capricious in its assessment. I know, having sat and presented before the governor and cabinet sitting as the trustees of the Internal Improvement Trust Fund, that you seldom really have a direct connection to those individuals to talk about your project. What you end up doing is you end up presenting your project to cabinet aides. Cabinet aides talk about it, they poke at it, they discuss it, they decide if they want it or not. You finally get to a point where you have a sense that you have enough votes in favor of your project, and you might get in front of the governor and cabinet to allow them to decide if they're going to issue authorization for you to dredge through resource protection areas. Again, this is a really big one right here. Is this chapter 1820, this is the Aquatic Preserve Administrative Code. It says that facilities and access channels shall be prohibited in resource protection areas 1 or 2, which is what we've got out in Charlotte Harbor. That's a pretty serious deal killer when you're talking with the governor cabinet, but they have the latitude to make those decisions because they're the ones, again, it's an administrative code. It's not Florida statute. So when I look at trying to deal with those individuals up in Tallahassee and the politics that goes with that, and having spoken with Mr. McQueen on what his interests are, and again, I want to reiterate too, the conversations with Mr. McQueen when I made the presentation on behalf of the Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance, I said to Bucky, I said, Bucky, I got to have a bottom dollar cost. If the city decides to do your property, do this project through your property, what is your bottom line dollar cost that you would accept? And he replied in writing that I can put into this budget. And it was $400,000. Now, he has no interest whatsoever in collecting that amount of money. What he's interested in doing is transferring development credits off of that property to another piece of property, which is something city council can do internally here. So I basically got one individual as the property owner negotiating with a group of individuals here. I think I'm going to be much more successful having that happen quickly versus trying to negotiate with the governor and cabinet in Tallahassee. So when it came to ownership negotiations, the stuff where I'm going to have to deal with the trustees up in Tallahassee didn't rank real well. Negotiations with Mr. McQueen actually I felt ranked a lot better. But again, backing up, it's an arbitrary and capricious assessment. Alternative assumptions, maintenance, shared maintenance costs. This was actually pretty simple. If we take a project that takes us out to Charlotte Harbor through the perimeter canal and doesn't use Alligator Creek, it's solely on the shoulders of the citizens of Punta Gorda. If I'm going through a project that incorporates Alligator Creek, I'm looking at potentially cost share between the local governments, potentially the MSBU, and potentially West Coast Inland Navigational District. So there's a financial issue associated with who's going to do the long-term, who's going to share the cost of the long-term maintenance. So while you're increasing boat traffic on Alligator Creek, you're also increasing the users that can then share the cost of maintenance in the long term. And I think that was important. And then longevity. This is a tough one because we don't have any sediment transport values for what's happening in Charlotte Harbor other than what the frequency of maintenance is. The open areas of the channel, we've got sustainability channel based on infill rates and exposure to sediment transport like wind waves, tide, and discharges. The open areas of Charlotte Harbor, they're subject to sediment movement depending on weather events. We can have a serious weather event come in from the northwest and totally fill in the entrance channel out in open water. Similarly, Alligator Creek, with significant rainfall events in a main drainage way, we could get some filling and sediments moving around the creek that could potentially fill in the channel. It's really hard to know what that, and again, I talk about the 90-degree turn to the flow alignment. It's really hard to know what that longevity is going to be until you, A, build it and design it to allow for some infill rates, take a look at the frequency of maintenance dredging that's occurred with the previous channel in Alligator Creek, and you can run some general assumptions to get you kind of a ballpark time frame, but again, the longevity is going to be one that's going to be an issue. And the 90-degree turn was a concern that I had. But again, that's a design where what we've done before in situations like that is actually widen a channel, dredge an area updrift or upstream of the main channel as a collection basin. Let the collection basin fill up. When that fills up and the water, that sediment starts to migrate into the main navigation channel, you dredge a collection basin and you never alter the navigation channel. So there are ways to design around those kinds of issues. This was a matrix that we came up with. This was what I did, actually went through and looked at all these numbers, assigned these values. And again, this is a test run. Alternative 5 came out to be the best, in part because of the number of turns, as I said before. It's the number of turns that kind of killed Alternative 6, which was the original Punta Gorda Boaters Alliance recommendation. Again, those things can be modified and adjusted when we take a look at resource impacts. But this gets us to a point where the ranking, we talked about these. Bird Cut West was the top pick. It only beat out the Bird Cut East based on the number of turns. The Bird Cut East was the second best option. And then, not surprisingly, a lot of these alternatives 4, 5, and 6 ranked high because we're utilizing an already maintained waterway, Alligator Creek. So there's less impacts. There's less resource impacts. There's less dredging impacts and less cost impacts. So the others you see as you move right down, the worst was the Mosquito Ditch, and that's principally because we would be building what's essentially a new channel through mangroves for an extensive distance. Moving forward, again, this is a preliminary assessment matrix. This is to receive input from City Council if we're going on the right direction, how they want to proceed on pursuing an option. The idea is that if we can pursue an option, 1 or potentially 2, we're expending resources on field verifying the data that we've assumed here. That saves costs for the city. Go through and re-rank those options based on a final format. In other words, if you guys want to make adjustments on the turns or you feel that there's something should be looked at differently, maybe one of you is a close friend of Governor Scott and can swing this deal right through with the governor and cabinet, who knows. Those kind of things, we would re-rank the options. Then once we have those options re-ranked, we would proceed with in the field verifying the assumptions and refine the design elements of the top pick, taking into account the 4 pages I received from Howard, which was a great summary of all of the input from the residents in the public hearing that we had. And then from that, we would come up with what I would say is our final design, which we would then generate a final opinion of cost and a time frame for permitting, and then we would submit a final package to the City Council for consideration regarding how you're going to fund it and whether you're going to move forward with permit applications. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans.
Let's let Howard start, then I
So-
will go.
From a staff standpoint, here are the decision points that we're going to ask you to make today, if you can. Number 1, do you agree with the matrix? If that answer is yes, if the answer is no, do you want to tweak it? If the answer is yes, do you agree with the top 3 choices? If the answer is no, do you want to rearrange the top 3 choices? Or do you want to take those top 3 choices and maybe just have top 1 or 2 choices? And then 3, do you want to move to the next step? Now, we've already spent about $36,000. It was a loan from the BGI Canal Maintenance Fund. We go to the next step, we're going to start spending some more significant dollars. And where are those monies coming from? From a staff standpoint, and this was presented months and months and months ago, we need to put together an assessment area right away so that we can, if you want to move forward, we need to establish the assessment area, put together an assessment methodology so that we can assess the property owners in this assessment area. First, pay back the $36,000 and start paying for all of the next phases of the project up to and including permitting, which is going to take some time and some significant dollars.
Okay, let's start first with technical questions on the presentation. And so can you come back to the podium for us, please? I guess in my, I think I understood almost everything. The main issue that I have are the differences between number 4 and 5. Is it just the location of the cut?
Yes. Item 4, the new channel connection to Alligator Creek would be solely on state-owned bottomlands in aquatic preserve by definition, and requires negotiations with the governor and cabinet to having them approve that channel alignment. Item 5 puts the channel on Bucky McQueen's property, but on the southwest side, which reduces the number of turns. So it's a straight shot in. The only turn you have to
Still a
deal
straight shot.
with is where it makes the connection into the perimeter canal and then eventually into, well, actually, in that one, it goes direct to Alligator Creek and makes one turn.
So the ownership negotiations on number 4 is a 1, and on number 5, it's a 10,
Correct.
because we're not having to go to the governor and the cabinet.
That's correct.
Even if we go on private land, do we, I mean, there's still permitting, obviously, but is that is out of the,
Well, there's jurisdictional issues. I'm outside of the jurisdiction of being in, the only area I fall into being in an aquatic preserve is in Alligator Creek proper. Everything else is privately owned bottomlands. I'm coming out of Punta Gorda Isle Canal, the perimeter canal, which that's private lands, city-owned. I'm on a piece of private property that's owned by Bucky McQueen. I come into basically Alligator Creek. When I make the intersection with Alligator Creek, that's the only time I start working on publicly owned bottomlands. And I'm operating or I'm working in an area that's already been impacted by a navigation channel that has markers and has been dredged, and it's, you know, that's generally got the least amount of resource impacts.
that's another question that I have. When I was on Alligator Creek, it seems much wider than 25 feet. Is that marker to marker? Is that what you're,
The 25-foot bottom width is the design width. There's areas, I think, in the cross sections that I did from N through O, there actually was no dredging required because there was already plenty of water depth in that corner where the water's moved out and where the markers are. Basically, the area right where the intersection would be with the first canal or any of the last three alternatives, that turns out to be the shallowest area that we've got, and it's basically a deposition area because of all the outfall coming from Alligator Creek.
okay. I think those are my technical questions. We'll go this way. Nancy?
Yeah, I'm very familiar with Alligator Creek, and it may be wide, but it's the channel that's narrow, and I appreciate that you've included that in all of your recommendations, because I think the residents that use Alligator Creek were expressing that needs to be included in the recommendation, so thank you for that. I do have a point of clarification, and that is that all of the residents who use Alligator Creek pay into the Alligator Creek Waterway MSBU. And it is not a fee just to access it. We pay that for the maintenance of Alligator Creek. Yes, we do, Jay. I pay into it. And personally. And everybody pays into it. And that fee right now is $25. Could change depending on the Alligator Creek Waterway Advisory Committee, and they are going out to bid right now, if they haven't already gone out to bid for the dredging. So they're thrilled to have the permit in hand and to be able to proceed on that. Another thing I wanted to just point out, in your, one of your, it's in the diagram, or in the exhibit with the vessel traffic density.
Yes.
And I just want to make people aware that you point out that there are 3,155 slips already on Alligator Creek. When you add up area 1, 2, and 3, the total number of slips comes to almost 5,000. And that's far more than slips that are actually in the south part of PGI right now. So if people feel like right now Ponce Inlet is crowded, it's going to transfer some of that crowded condition over to Alligator Creek. I'm not against the Alligator Creek cut. I'm just making people aware. It may not be the panacea that we think, from that standpoint, that we think it is.
Any other technical questions? Okay.
No, I think that's really it.
Okay, Gary?
Okay. Minor, so first of all, I think the matrix was done very well. Because
you.
going into this process, I thought that 3 of the potential cuts were no-brainer, never going to happen, particularly because of the small-tooth sawfish. And you've obviously have narrowed those down to the ones that would have the least impact on those. That type of thing can be, it doesn't matter, you're not going to get it permitted. And I want to thank you for do that. I just would like to be clear in 4, 5, and 6 that there probably would be, for all practical purposes, no impact on seagrass?
That's correct.
Okay, I think that's just something we should note, that that's another impact, because that also could be a no-brainer.
The only area that there may potentially be seagrasses is from the alternative 4 and 5, which comes out on the southwest side of Bucky McQueen's property, goes through a shallow water area that may have seagrasses before you get to Alligator Creek. So there
Okay.
is a potential, but it's a much lesser potential than the seagrasses that would exist in Charlotte Harbor, in my opinion.
And that's what I would expect. And I just want to be clear as we discuss these, that we may not want to just pick one, because there might be one that could alter what might be our first pick to make it our last pick if it's something that's not able to be mitigated. As far as mitigating mangroves, there's obviously a mechanism in place that type of issue can be dealt with. So I just also, and this is not technical to this, but just to point out that there would also be other ramifications in the cut. This would allow the bird section, which is probably the least built-out area in PGI, to be developed at a more rapid pace. That would put a need for more city assets, fire potential and so forth. But I just want to say, most of those assets are already in place. We might have to buy some equipment and so forth, but we do have buildings and so forth. So that is an impact. We would have increased revenues because of the development, but not these huge impacts because of building assets and so forth. So I just want to make that comment.
Thank you. Tom?
Yes, on the technical component, concerning what Nancy brought up before on the traffic shed, that's the Alligator Creek traffic shed of 3,155 slips. Did you look into the Punta Gorda Ponds traffic shed, the impact of that at all?
I did not look at I know what Sea Grant's number is for all of the boats that access the Ponce Inlet. That's on the Sea Grant study. What I did was I used the Sea Grant study for the area of vessels coming into Alligator Creek, and then actually did specific counts within the Punta Gorda Isles areas that we were looking at to really drill down to what the potential final build-out number of slips could be. Now, obviously, there's some variation in there, but I would say there's a 90% confidence in those numbers being applicable, certainly on the same level as what Sea Grant did with the work they did up Alligator Creek.
Okay, I did take a look into those numbers that Sea Grant put out for the Ponce Inlet, and they are it's 4,261 moorings in PGI canal system that would be using Ponce. That's about 170% increase on build-out as well. So any way you look at it, we're going to have more boats coming out Ponce or more boats coming out Alligator Creek as we grow. The other technical question I have for you is the channel length regarding alternative bird cut number 6. Why did we pick 6,132 feet when the distance from where from Alligator Creek all the way out seems to be a lot, or the distance from when you leave the cut into Alligator Creek, if you go to marker 21 and 22, which is the area where the speed changes, you go from slow speed to hull speed. I don't understand why we went all the way out to channel marker number 1 when the channel in Alligator Creek at that point is 50 feet wide, and there is I believe it's 50 feet wide, and you can answer that for me, and there is no restrictions on speed.
I think that was the outcome of discussions with staff and the fact that when we looked at our distance calculations, we also used channel markers 1 and 2 at Ponce Inlet. So we looked at where the Ponce Inlet channel comes out into Charlotte Harbor and basically the channel terminates, and where Alligator Creek comes out into Charlotte Harbor and that channel terminates, because those channels are being used by the boaters that we're talking about here. And though they may be in good condition today, there may come a time when there may be an infill process that affects potentially the channel around markers 1 and 2, that we would have to engage in some sort of maintenance dredging. And so looking down the road, what are my resources available to help restore that navigational access in those channels? So where we don't really have any dredging that's due today, when we looked at that longevity matrix, that's one of the items why we went all the way out to 1 and 2 for both channels when calculating those travel times. And there's also interestingly enough, I think if you take a look at your manatee, the city's manatee plan, it talks about slow speed out to the -6-foot mean low water contour. So while people are still speeding through Alligator Creek, I think if you look closely at your ordinance within the city limits, you're subject to that slow speed out to the -6 contour line, which I'm assuming was a USGS contour map that was used as a reference. It's not in the ordinance, I can't find the map, but it talks about it in the ordinance. So just kind of, again, big picture, if council wants to direct us to adjust those in some fashion, we can. It's not a problem, it's ready to redo the math on the spreadsheet.
Kim?
I just want to clarify, so number 6 was the original that the Boaters Alliance, and number 5 is ranking the highest.
That's-
But our 5 and 6 are both on Mr. McQueen's property?
Correct,
Okay, so it's really just number 4 that we'd be dealing with the state?
correct.
Okay, all right, that's,
Can you give us some opinion to that? As far as the benefits of working with a private property owner versus the process that he's outlined?
Yes, and I also have another comment that I'd like to make if every, the other
Yeah.
council members. Certainly, you have much more control over the negotiations when you're talking to a private owner. And also the opportunity, as Hans has pointed out, to maybe negotiate a purchase that doesn't necessarily involve dollars out of the taxpayer's pocket. But I do have a question, Hans, and you can shoot me down if I'm wrong. Where in your matrix did you address permittability?
Well, it's the sum total of all the different sections that we've talked about. And maybe we didn't make it real clear, but, clear from the standpoint of resource impacts, the project that takes out the most number of mangroves is going to have the least ability of being permitted. But permitting is a really hard one to nail down and to rank.
Well, here's my point, and again, you can shoot me down if I'm wrong. In my many years of getting environmental permits from state and federal agencies, well, we being the city, may have a greater concern for navigation safety. The agencies, when they permit it, although they are required to look at navigation, will rank navigation here and impacts to mangroves, for example, way up here.
Absolutely.
And so if you take, as from a practical permittability perspective, if you take the item, I guess it's number 6 on your matrix, and just eliminate those numbers from 5 and 6 alternatives, the alternative 6 clearly is the number 1 choice.
Well, that was what I presented to you all about a few months ago, but understanding the input from the citizens, I felt it was important, and I think City Council felt important to have as objective and independent of an assessment as we could do for all of those alignments so that there was some documentation to that effect. But, I mean, when I looked at this based on my skills and how long I've been doing permitting, as long as you have, I don't want to say the alignment 6 was a no-brainer, but certainly both alignment 6 is the one that presents the least amount of permitting difficulty of all of the options. And you're absolutely correct in terms of talking with the state and federal agencies. Even alignment 6 is going to have some issues because I've got to impact mangroves where they interface with the canals on both ends. And that's, again, small tooth sawfish habitat. Now, one of the items that came up was talking about the 4-page list I got from Howard. In that design that we did, there was upland areas on Mr. McQueen's property that had been filled that were originally mangroves that we could excavate down and actually create sawfish habitat as direct mitigation for what we'd be impacting. So while National Marine Fisheries Service looks at small-tooth sawfish impacts in a very narrow way, you're taking this out. I don't care what you're doing to replace it or fix it, you're just taking this out. I think it's going to be a more negotiable permitting situation than the other alternatives.
And I just wanted the council to hear that. I agree with Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now let's just get into the discussion about the matrix, and then we can get into the decision-making process. So I think the matrix is what we asked for, and we did ask you to look at all the alternatives, and clearly, the travel distance is an important aspect of this, so 4, 5, and 6 are really the viable alternatives for me. Now, 5, I understand the 4 is more of like a straight shot, so to say, but then you're saying we're going through the permitting process with the state. And is it more of a straight shot than number 5?
No, number 5 is the straight shot. Number
the straight
4,
shot.
you have to make basically 2 45s or 2 dog legs to come off of the perimeter canal and get into the new channel that would be on state-owned lands outside of Mr. McQueen's property.
Okay. So really, I mean, based on, what David just said about number 6, I still think 5 would be the preferred route because of the safety issues and the turns. I mean, it just makes more sense. I get it that it's less in the distance and how much we would have to excavate and how much we would have to mitigate and those type of things. So, I mean, I want to hear how the rest of you feel about that, and then we can get into how we move on, if we are moving on, that type of thing. Tom?
I don't know if you'll all receive the vote. I prefer number 6 as well. I think number 6 is probably the best way for us to go. But I think, from what I understand, we need we should be pursuing 2 alternatives as we push this process along, if that's what we decide to do.
That's council's discretion. I mean, what you'll end up doing is you'll end up coming up with the best design that you can to address all of the issues that were expressed by the residents, that you can get through permitting. And then when you do your pre-apps with the agencies, now you got to deal with all of them wanting to fingerprint your project, and they all do. They all want to tweak it. They want to get their 2 cents worth in. So you kind of have to give it your best shot and then expect that it's going to morph over time. Now, the way that you can bring the alignment number 6 as the priority would be to simply soften the turns. And I think somebody provided me a sketch. It may have been, I don't know who it was, but someone provided me a sketch which showed coming off of the perimeter canal and basically going through a softer turn process to get to Alligator Creek. And you would still be coming out on that canal that's on the south side before you got into Alligator Creek. But again, and that's lessened impacts. But if you address the navigational features, and I think someone else talked about creating a funnel effect where it narrows down to those sections of the waterway that's straight and then opens up for those areas that you're making turns, that's all final design features that we're not even to that point yet, unless City Council says, well, let's start on that one and let's start getting with the design. And that's, again, at council's discretion.
Kim?
So would your recommendation be to pick just one? Would be our best way to go, or you think we should pick 2? I mean, if people are going to want to put their imprint on it, as you say, if we have 2 options, they're going to, and we're really pursuing 6, and they say, well, I kind of like 5. I want you to look at this. Now we're adding more cost, saying, oh, well, I want you to look at 5 for this, and I want you to look at 6 for this, and pretty soon you're really doing full design on 5 and 6.
Correct. If you looked at 5, what we would do is we would go back out and field verify some of our assumptions in terms of water depth. Do we have seagrasses where it exits into the Alligator Creek proper? What are our final water depths that we have today? Because that's going to drive what our volume calculations are, et cetera, et cetera. Same thing with 6. I think we can do a more refined presentation on both of those 2 alignments and start dealing with some of the, grander issues.
So to be practical, if we chose 5 and 6, so to speak, you could then go out and maybe do some more analysis and come back with, say, okay, we're gonna go with 6, or we're gonna go
We
with
could,
5?
what we would do is we could take a look at both 5 and 6. We can refine that to what would be basically almost a 80% design, which would then give you also an opinion of cost. It would also tell you what your mitigation costs are going to be. And we could come back, because now what you're starting to drill down to is what's the cost of the project. You know, right now, we're just looking at big scope issues. When you start getting into what's the cost of the project and how is that going to affect boater navigation, and I think everybody that spoke here was basically expressing some concern over navigational safety. You know, you refine that design, we can do that. And that's, again, council's discretion.
Okay, thank you.
And just what you said about number 6, if we have to soften here and widen there, we don't know that cost would catch up with number 5 eventually.
That's
By
correct.
doing those design treatments. So I think the 2 alternatives would be a smart way to go, at least in this phase here.
Here's, oh, I'm sorry.
No, you.
You can go, Bert. You may say the same thing I was gonna say.
Here's a big difference between representing a local government or a private client. We could decide for ourselves that number 5 is our preferred option for whatever reason we may want to do that. And have a discussion regarding that as to why we want to do it. And maybe it's just because we want to keep it a straighter cut. And if we were to do some further investigation with respect to alternative 6, to quantify the number of mangroves, how much area for mitigation we might have, taking out exotics and stuff like that, and kept that, or tried to keep that in our back pocket and go forward with number 5, because it's a public record, we can't hide that from the DEP, and their requirement is, or our requirement is, to present the best alternative. If we were private clients, we could go with number 5 and really hit hard on number 5. And so I just think, since we're ultimately going to have to present evidence with respect to number 6 at some point or other in order to save money, if the only difference is the navigation aspect, you can save money by going to number 6 and trying to improve or soften, as Hans would say, the navigational impacts.
Gary?
I think it comes down to a point that David made a little bit earlier, and it comes down to the point that I have with the ecological stuff. We can talk about navigation and so forth, but those can be deal breakers. And I think that we need to pursue two at the same time, and then let that filter itself out to tell us who we want to pursue as we determine which is the most ecologically permittable route. It seems to me we have a couple good routes here. We may not get our best route, but we may get our only permittable route if we pursue those 2 at the same time. And I would assume, Howard, that doesn't mean that we can't ask staff to already start figuring out what the assessment areas would be and so forth, and how to fund this as we're parallelly trying to narrow this down.
You haven't decided whether you even want to do an assessment.
I'm saying, if we make that decision, I'm assuming we
Yes.
can do these things
We
in
can get
parallel.
started right away.
Nancy and then Tom?
What I heard you say, David, was you really felt we should go with 1 and not 2. When I was listening to you, because what you were saying, since we are in the public domain, that the FDEP and other permitting agencies will know what we're thinking, and they will perhaps force us into the one that will have the least impact on the environment.
Correct. I mean, I just think that's the
And-
practical reality. I don't think it really serves any benefit to have 2 unless there's, something that maybe Hans may have overlooked that would turn the tide on some other aspect of the project that might be considered to be more detrimental to the environment. Maybe I won't even go into what could be, but, I mean, that's a possibility.
Yeah.
But, I would say go with the option that intuitively is the one that's more permittable. If the state requires us to do more work to to say, well, why didn't you pick number 5? Because maybe all of a sudden they've had, you know, a light shine on them that navigation should be a higher ranking. But I think you could save money by just going and picking out what's the best one and making that work.
Tom?
Thank you.
Looking at the amount of material that needs to be excavated between 6 and 5, alternative number 5 has almost twice the amount of material that would need to be excavated. That, I think, is something that DEP would be looking at. Added to that is if the $400,000 cost that we spoke about negotiating with Mr. McQueen, if that gets negotiated down to some other component, it drives the cost of that